One of my biggest flaws isn't necessarily laziness, but my ability to fall asleep anywhere and in any situation. In fact, this almost got me killed when I was on vacation with my cousins about 8 years ago. We were all visiting our grandmother in New Zealand that summer, and it was actually only my second time ever visiting. My first time, I remember going to the beach and renting a couple of kayaks, which was a blast and certainly on the itinerary for the second trip. So on the third day of visiting, I'm sure you can imagine my excitement to find out we were going to the beach for the day. As soon as we parked my cousin's car, I made a straight line to the rental office that we had used the last time and began working on the paperwork required to rent the kayak and a life jacket. My plan was to be out on the water for literally the entire day. Only, I never imagined how I would have accomplished that goal. You see, after about an hour or so being out on the water, underneath the hot sun, I found myself drifting a bit far from the coastline and my family, so I decided to bring myself a bit closer to the beach. After doing so, I figured I could relax a bit. The water was calm after all, so I put my paddles across my lap and began to unwind. In no time, and without intending to, my eyes ended up closing and I surely drifted off, both figuratively and literally. None of my cousins noticed it, but at some point while I was asleep, my kayak must have begun drifting away from the coast, much like it had earlier, only this time I wasn't awake to correct the issue. Now, I had always been told that I was a heavy sleeper, but I would have never guessed that it would have taken my kayak tipping over to wake me up. My eyes shot open and my body jumped back from its lifeless slumber as soon as I felt the cold water touch my skin. I was in full panic mode as I resurfaced and noticed that it was no longer daylight out. I grabbed a hold of my kayak and began to look around in a panic, and I couldn't see anything. There was no sign of life, no people, no boats, no land. I tried my best not to panic, but I couldn't help it. My heart was pounding, and all I kept hoping was that I would wake up from this nightmare. But when I did wake up, I knew that I was in a very real situation and that I had to act quickly. I flipped my kayak back over and tried to climb back inside, but I didn't have the strength or the leverage to pull myself up. Every time I got close, I fell back or flipped the kayak again. I decided that the next best thing would most likely be to just hold onto the kayak and let the boat and my life jacket keep me afloat so that I can exert as little energy as possible. I spent the next couple of hours that night drifting along and trying to catch my bearings and doing my best not to think what creatures might be lurking below the surface just waiting to turn me into a meal. There were times that night when I couldn't tell the difference between the surface of the water and the black of the night sky. It was almost as they blended into one along the horizon. I was overjoyed when I noticed the sun beginning to rise. Though I was still in a dire situation, the light seemed to give me a bit of hope. The hope soon faded as the heat began to bear down on me. My body was already severely burnt from falling asleep in the sun the day before, and it was only getting worse while I drifted along. Even though I wasn't swimming, I didn't have to do much to keep myself afloat. I could feel my energy fading away from me. Throughout the day, I had hoped to find land, but there was nothing. And as the sun began to fall from the sky, I prepared myself for another terrifying night in the water. Now, I'm not a religious person, but I must have had a guardian looking over me because just as the sun was going down, I spotted a small dot on the horizon. I knew it had to be a boat, and even though I knew it most likely couldn't see me, I began to flail my arms and do everything I could to flag the vessel down. And to my surprise, it turned its course towards me, and within 10 minutes was right on top of me. I was pulled out of the water by a small sailing vessel that was owned by a very nice couple that was on their way to New Zealand for their own vacation. I will forever be grateful to Rick and Sarah for saving my life that day. I was told that I drifted roughly 18 nautical miles offshore and was lucky to be alive. You see, it turned out my family had reported what happened and had people looking for me, only they were looking in the entirely wrong area. Not that I can blame them. I'm just thankful to be alive. If you have never thought about visiting Alaska for a few weeks of your life, I would highly recommend you change your mind. Even though I nearly lost my life to harsh weather there, it is still one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen in my entire life. From the beautiful, particularly untouched landscapes to the warm and welcoming people that you meet, it's a truly amazing place. That is, unless you get stuck outdoors during a storm. And let me tell you, I know that firsthand. It was 2004, and I was spending a few weeks with a couple of friends from school. We had all decided to go visit our buddy who moved up to Alaska from Connecticut when we were teenagers, and we hadn't seen him since. The reunion was one for the ages, and the first couple of nights in the snowy wilderness was like nothing I had ever experienced before. Caleb and his family had a nice cabin just outside of Homer, Alaska, and we spent most of our time either inside by the fire or outside on the snowmobile exploring the landscape. One afternoon, we had been out in the snow, and we found a pretty large grove of trees that had a lot of room for us to ride around and speed through the large gaps between the snow-covered trees. It was a blast for a while. Aside from the one spill that we had when our friend Sean wasn't paying attention and crashed into a tree. He was fine, but it was still a bit concerning. Things got really serious though at around 3 in the afternoon, when out of nowhere the wind picked up and a snowstorm began raging through the area. Within a matter of minutes, none of us could see more than 3 or 4 feet ahead of us. Thankfully, Caleb was with us, and we knew that as long as we stayed with him, he would be able to guide us safely back to his cabin. We all made sure to stick close to one another as we began to ride our snowmobiles back to the cabin. But even with our lights on, we could hardly see the backs of each other's snowmobiles through the snow. We reached a point where we would all have to go in a single file line instead of 2 rows of 2, and I ended up being put at the back of the line. I wasn't too concerned though, because I knew as long as I could see the taillights and reflectors in front of me, I would be heading the right way. However, it's just my luck that as we were making our way through the narrow grouping of trees, the snowmobile I had been riding began to shut down on me. I barely made it through the trees and managed to go a bit further before it was officially off. The battery was still running, but the engine was dead. This meant that I could still have the lights on for as long as the battery would last, but I wasn't going anywhere. All I could do was hope that my friends would realize I wasn't behind them and come back for me as soon as possible. I waited for hours, and there was no sign of my friends. Surely they knew I was missing at that point, but perhaps due to the storm they felt that it was too dangerous to come looking for me. I never asked them because I was just so grateful when I was finally discovered. I knew that they had done everything they could. Darkness overcame the wilderness around me, and it wasn't long after that when my snowmobile battery died and the only light I had finally gave out on me. I wasn't sure what I should do. All I knew was that I was freezing and I needed to find a way out. I made the mistake of trying to walk my way back to that cabin, and I ended up just walking for the entire night through thick snow and ice-cold winds, and didn't find myself any closer to safety. I managed to walk for a couple hours the next day before finally collapsing from the cold. My body couldn't take it anymore. The numbness that was coursing through my bones was slowly turning into sharp and searing pain. I propped myself up next to a tree and waited for what I thought was going to be an icy death. Lucky for me, I managed to walk in the direction of Caleb's closest neighbor, and after spotting myself leaning against a tree about a half-mile from his cabin, he saved my life. Sadly, I had severe frostbite on both my hands. They could only save 7 of my fingers, though I still have permanent nerve damage in both of my hands. One of the greatest feats that I have ever achieved was getting my pilot's license. I'm not allowed, nor am I capable of flying commercial airplanes, but instead, I own a single-engine plane that has room for 3 passengers and myself. Living in Australia, I tend to use my plane mostly when I go on vacation. I can use it to take me to most of the nearby areas and islands. I've only ever had one incident while I was in the sky that almost resulted in my death and ended up leaving me stranded on a desert island for 3 days. It was while I was flying my plane from Australia to the city of Makati in the Philippines. I had a couple of business meetings there for my company, and then I figured I could take a 2-week vacation and relax a bit in a nice hotel. That would all change though, as soon as I was about halfway through my flight. It was then when I heard the dreaded sound of a sputtering engine, and I realized right there that I was in trouble. Within seconds, the engine of my plane stalled and ultimately turned off, and I was unable to get it to turn back on before my plane began falling from the sky. I made an immediate note on my surroundings, and to my luck, there was a small island nearby, so I figured a water landing near that island would be the best bet at surviving. I did everything I could to slow my descent and steer myself toward the water just off the coast of the island. And as I got closer to the ground, I was almost certain that I was about to die. Thankfully, when the plane made an impact with the water, it did so at the right angle and slow enough to where I was simply tossed around in my seat a bit. I put out a quick mayday signal before ultimately hopping out of my now sinking plane and into the deep blue water. It was a tough fight through the tide and current, but I ended up being able to swim to the island. Sadly, there was no inhabitants. You see, the island was so small that I could see one side from the other, and there were 0 signs of life. There weren't even any trees, just a bit of tall grass. The first thing I did when I managed to wash up on the shore was look back at my plane, only it had already been fully submerged and I could hardly tell where I had come from. All I could do was hope that my distress signal made it out and that someone was going to find me soon. Days passed, and without any food or water, I was on the verge of death. Every movement hurt and my head was pounding. There was no shelter from the sun, and I knew I was feeling the symptoms of sun poisoning. If I didn't receive help soon, I would have surely been a goner, and it would have been a slow and painful death. To my surprise though, on the 3rd day of being trapped on the island, I heard the distinct sound of a motor not too far in the distance. It took all of my strength to sit up and look around, but wincing through the pain, I could see a small motorboat in the distance. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I ended up taking a handful of tall grass and sticks and waved my hands high above my head. It's a good thing that they were specifically looking for me, because I don't think they would have seen me from their peripheral vision had they not been looking directly at the island around them. The 2 men on the boat rushed over to me and gave me water and covered me as they got me into their boat. It's lucky for me that my company knew where I was going, because when I didn't check in with them after 2 days, they decided to ping my cell phone, and when they saw that it had last had a signal in the middle of the ocean, they knew something was wrong and called the authorities. It turns out that my distress signal never made it out.